Before books filled our shelves, before stories were written down, they were carried by voices, around fires, across generations, from one traveler to another. Welcome to Fireside Stories. Tonight, let's revisit one of the tales that refuse to be forgotten. There is an old saying in parts of the Czech Republic: if you pass a lonely pond at dusk and see an old man sitting on the bank, leave him alone, especially if he is smoking a pipe. At first he seems perfectly ordinary. He nods politely as you pass. Perhaps he is mending a fishing net. Perhaps he is watching the water. Perhaps he is simply enjoying the evening. Nothing about him appears unusual until you notice his coat never seems to dry. The water around his boots never ripples, and although his pipe burns steadily, the smoke drifts downward instead of rising into the air. If he smiles, be careful, because the old man by the pond may not be a fisherman at all. He may be the Vodnik. For centuries across Czech Republic, Slovakia, and parts of Poland and Germany, people spoke of a strange water spirit who lived in ponds, rivers, and mill streams. He wasn't a monster that lurked beneath the surface, waiting to attack. He lived among people. He watched them. Sometimes he helped them, sometimes he drowned them. And inside his home, beneath the water, it was said he kept the souls of the drowned, carefully sealed away inside tiny porcelain cups. Unlike many spirits we have encountered around this fire, the Vodnik wasn't driven by rage, or revenge, or hunger. He simply belonged to the water, and anyone who forgot that risked becoming part of his collection. Unlike dragons or giants or creatures that hide at the edge of the map, the Vodnik was never believed to live far away. His home was often the village pond, the slow moving river behind the mill, the quiet bend in the stream where the water seemed darker than everywhere else. If there was water, there was always the possibility that someone already lived there. Across Czech lands, Slovakia, and neighboring parts of Central Europe, stories describe the Vodnik as a solitary spirit bound to fresh water. He was neither god nor demon, neither entirely kind nor entirely cruel. He simply belonged to the water in the same way a fox belongs to the forest or an owl belongs to the night. Most stories describe him as a man, not a handsome young stranger like the Natin or a terrifying monster. Instead, he often appeared as an ordinary villager. He wore an old green coat, broad brimmed hat, heavy leather boots. Sometimes he carried a walking stick, sometimes a fishing rod, sometimes nothing at all. At first glance, you might mistake him for an elderly fisherman enjoying a quiet afternoon, but then you notice the details. His clothes were always dripping wet, even on the hottest summer day. Water trickled constantly from the sleeves of his coat. Pond weed clung to his boots. His hair looked as though he had just climbed from the bottom of the river. Some stories say his face had a greenish tint. Others gave him bulging eyes like a frog, or skin mottled with algae. Yet none of these features made him truly frightening. It was how completely at ease he seemed. He wasn't hiding, he wasn't hunting. He simply watched the water as though it belonged to him, because according to the old stories, it did. Each pond, each mill stream, each quiet stretch of river might have had its own Vodnik, its own silent keeper. The villagers knew where those places were. Children learned their names long before they were old enough to swim, not because every pond held danger, but because every body of water deserved respect, and somewhere beneath its still surface, someone might already be watching. If the Vodnik drowned someone, the story did not end beneath the water. It was only beginning. Among the oldest Czech and Slovak tales is a belief so strange that it has never quite left the imagination. The Vodnik did not simply take lives, he collected souls, not in chains, not in cages, but inside tiny cups. Sometimes they were said to be made of porcelain, sometimes clay, sometimes delicate glass no human craftsman had ever touched. Each one held a single soul, carefully sealed, carefully kept. hidden inside the Vodnik's home beneath the surface of the pond. No one agreed exactly why he collected them. Some stories say the souls were his greatest treasure. Others believed they gave him power. A few claimed he simply disliked being alone. Whatever the reason, the cups were never to be disturbed. There are old tales of curious fishermen who dreamed of an underwater house, a house furnished like any other, a table, a stove, a chair beside the fire. Only instead of shelves filled with books or food, they found rows upon rows of tiny cups, each one perfectly arranged, each one containing a soul waiting in silence. In some stories, a grieving family manages to recover one of these cups. When it is opened, the trapped soul is finally released. Peace returns, the dead can rest. But such endings are rare. Far more often, the cups remain where they are, lying neatly upon their shelves beneath the green water, waiting. The warden didn't kill people because he hated people. He simply believed that what the water claimed belonged to the water, and he was its keeper. Perhaps that's what makes the legend so unsettling. The Vodnik doesn't behave like a beast, he behaves like a careful collector, patient, orderly, almost gentle, until you realize what it is he's collecting. If you asked a villager where the Vodnik lived, they wouldn't point to a cave or a ruined castle. They would point to the deepest part of the pond, because beneath its quiet surface there was said to be another world. The old stories describe underwater homes that looked strangely familiar. There were wooden tables, shelves, warm fireplaces that somehow never went out, windows through which green light filtered instead of sunlight. It was less like a monster's lair and more like the home of an ordinary man, if you ignored the rows of tiny cups. The Vodnik spent his days much as any villager might. He smoked his pipe, mended fishing nets, tended his garden of water plants. Some tales even describe him keeping fish the way a farmer kept livestock. The uncanny lay not in what he did, but in how ordinary it all seemed. This wasn't a creature of endless violence. It had a routine, a home, a life, and that made encounters with the Vodnik deeply unpredictable. Some fishermen claimed he protected the fish in his pond. If treated with respect, the catch would be plentiful. Others believed he became furious if people polluted the water, fished greedily, or mocked the old traditions. A single act of disrespect, like throwing rubbish into the pond, breaking a promise made beside the water, or laughing at the stories, might be enough to earn his anger. Yet, there are also tales of people who spoke with the Vodnik without coming to harm. A miller might glimpse him at dawn, sitting on the riverbank smoking quietly. A washerwoman might hear him humming while the mist still clung to the reeds. Neither disturbed the other. Each simply acknowledged the other's presence. These moments revealed something important. The Vodnik wasn't imagined as a creature that wanted every human dead. He was the keeper of his water. Like any neighbor, he expected respect. Offer it, and you might pass in peace. Forget it, and the pond might remember your name long after everyone else had forgotten it. Perhaps that's why people were careful around quiet water, not because they expected to see the Vodnik every day, but because they believed they were always, somehow, a guest in his home. Long before fences surrounded reservoirs or warning signs marked dangerous waters, people relied on stories to keep them safe, and few places inspired more stories than the village pond. To us, a pond is simply water. To generations of villagers across Central Europe, it was something more. It watered the fields, turned the mill wheel, fed the fish, reflected the changing seasons, and it could also take a life in an instant. Children were taught never to play too close to the bank, not because every pond held a warning, but because any pond might. Parents warned their children not to shout at the water, not to throw stones into it for amusement, not to mock the quiet places where the reeds grew thickest. Even fishermen were said to greet the water before casting their nets. Whether these customs truly came from belief in the Vodnik or whether the stories grew from the customs themselves is impossible to know. Like all folklore, the two became impossible to separate. As Christianity spread across the region, the Vodnik changed with it. In some tales he became darker, more malicious, a servant of evil rather than a spirit of the landscape. Yet the older stories never disappeared completely. In them, the Vodnik wasn't the devil, he wasn't punishment. He was simply part of the natural order. The pond had fish, the forest had wolves, the river had currents, and the water had its keeper. Today, the Vodnik still appears in Czech and Slovak fairy tales, novels, paintings, theatre, and film. Children still grow up hearing the stories of the little green man beside the pond. Artists continue to paint him sitting on a willow stump, pipe in hand, watching the water as the evening falls. Perhaps that's because every village has a place like that, a quiet bend in the river, a forgotten mill pond, a stretch of water that somehow feels older than the people living beside it. Places where conversation grows quieter, where footsteps slow, where without quite knowing why, people still feel the urge to tread carefully, because some landscapes, even today, feel as though they belong to someone else. The Vortic never needed to chase anyone. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't announce himself with thunder or monstrous roars. He simply waited, watching the surface of the water, patient as the seasons themselves. Perhaps that's why his legend has endured, because every still pond invites the same question: what lies beneath? Sometimes the answer is only mud, fish, and tangled roots. But stories ask us to imagine something more: an old man in a green coat, a pipe glowing softly in the twilight, an underwater house where shelves are lined with delicate cups, each holding the memory of a life once lived. Whether anyone ever truly believed such a place existed is almost beside the point. The Vodnik gave a face to the quiet power of water. He reminded people that lakes and rivers were never simply part of the landscape. They were living places, places deserving of caution, respect, and sometimes a little mystery. So if you ever find yourself beside a lonely pond as evening settles in, and you notice an old fisherman sitting perfectly still on the opposite bank, perhaps give him a polite nod, then continue on your way. Some neighbors are best admired from a distance. Every culture has different stories, yet somehow they all speak to the same hopes, the same fears, and the same questions that make us human. Thank you for joining me around the fire. Until next time, keep the stories alive.